make a smart introduction. So, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here for another smart discussion. We had the great pleasure to have today with us Gillian Tett, that is editor and a well-known and remarkable columnist from Financial Times. Most of us read her with frequency in FT, and she has published in 2021, so 3 years ago, a very interesting book, Anthrovision, where she tries to give us a vision of how anthropology can explain business and life. So the idea was that Gillian could share with us some topics and some remarks about what she thinks from her book and from her long and very interesting experience in FT and in other places about this new society we are having, the changes that we are facing, the challenges we have for the future, and then we could have a discussion with the persons that I think that can be interesting. Gillian, thank you very much again for your disponibility. We know that you have a very complicated agenda, but it's a great honor for us here in Portugal to have this opportunity to share with you some ideas. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it's great to have a chance to talk to you all. It's a great privilege. And thank you for taking some time to listen to me. I, as you just heard, am indeed trained as a cultural anthropologist. I did a PhD in cultural anthropology. I'm just going to move my camera up a bit, in Cambridge many years ago. And then I became a financial journalist. And I've been working with the Financial Times now for about 30 years. And in the first decade or two, when I was a financial journalist, I would often get asked by colleagues or by financiers or by government officials or by CEOs what kind of topic I had a PhD in. And when I said anthropology, the response was almost always a bit of an eye roll. People would assume that the only degrees that really carried credibility was economics or quantitative science of some form, astrophysics or something like that. And it was not until the 2008 financial crisis happened that I began to talk about my strange background and how it had helped me to understand the world of finance, and why I'm actually very passionately convinced that anthropology is a really powerful tool that anybody can use in any area of business and economics and finance. And I would imagine that most of you probably think, well, that sounds a bit weird. Very few people I encounter in economics have got any background in cultural anthropology. And if they know anything at all about anthropology, they tend to imagine that it's a bit like Indiana Jones for academics, where essentially you have, anthropologists go off to strange, far-flung, exotic cultures like Brazil or Papua New Guinea and study ancient tribes to try and understand the nature of what it means to be human. And then they come back, and that what they learn is very interesting at a dinner party or a bar, but not much use for real life and not much use for looking at finance and economics. And in essence, that vision of anthropologists as being like Indiana Jones, is not surprising, because 150 years ago, that was what anthropologists.
Gillian, can I ask you if you can speak a little bit loudly, if it's possible? Sorry. Sorry for.
Okay.
Thank
Is
you.
it better? Can you hear me? Can you hear me better now? Is that better?
Yes. Thank you very much. And sorry. Okay. Thank you.
So 150 years ago, that image of cultural anthropology was indeed what anthropology was. In the 19th century, anthropologists were pretty racist and sexist and imperialist, because it very much came out of the Western European idea that the pinnacle of civilization was in Western Europe, and that the role of academics was to go around and study other cultures and see where essentially human had started, and essentially justify a lot of the empires and a lot of the practices that were happening in the 19th century. But in the last 150 years, anthropology has undergone a really quite radical change. And it's gone from being a very imperialist and racist and sexist discipline into being one of the disciplines that is very strongly dedicated to fighting against racism and sexism and imperialism. And is founded on the simple idea that essentially we're all human. Humans in all societies are prone to create tribal networks and to have all types of rituals and cultures and practices that essentially and symbols that reinforce their tribalism. Every culture or tribe looks strange to somebody else, but we can learn something from each other and we can learn about ourselves. And that applies as much to bankers or hedge fund managers as it does to headhunters in the Amazon forest or anybody else. And in essence, what anthropology believes in is the importance of engaging in a three-part journey. The first part is to try and periodically take yourself out of your comfort zone and put yourself into an unfamiliar culture to try and understand how different people think and live. It sounds very obvious, but doing that is so essential in a world of globalization because we all tend to fall into the mistake of thinking that the way that we think is natural and normal and inevitable and everyone else should think like that. But we almost always fail to see that actually other people think very differently. So the first step is to try and plunge yourself into another culture. The second step then is to not just use that experience to understand other people, but then to flip the lens and look back at yourself with a detached, fresh pair of eyes. You do that because the Chinese have a wonderful phrase, which is that a fish can't see water. None of us can see the assumptions that shape us until we jump out of our fishbowl, go swim with other fish, and then look back. And then the third step is to try and use that insider-outsider perspective to see not just the parts of the world which are obvious, which we take for granted, but also the parts of the world that we normally ignore because they are so familiar, and the assumptions that shape us. So in my case, I started my career with that first step in that three-part journey. I went as an anthropologist from Britain to a place called Soviet Tajikistan, which was very alien and very different from me. And I lived there for a couple of years and studied Tajik culture, immersed myself in Tajik culture, and tried very hard to understand how Tajik culture made sense of the world. And then in my second part of my journey, I came back to London, where I joined the Financial Times and tried to use that inside-outside perspective to study the world of finance and economics and banking, which in many ways was more familiar to me. But I tried to do that by looking at the world of finance as an outsider. And that is really the key thing which enabled me in the past to see where the credit markets were going wrong and how the tribalism of financial players, how the tribalism of bankers was essentially leading to the types of distortions that led to the 2008 financial crisis. So I very deliberately used exactly the same techniques that I'd used to study Tajik wedding rituals to look at investment banking conferences and to try and understand the hidden cultural patterns and how it was causing financiers to go wrong. And since then, I've used the same inside-outside perspective to try and look at all aspects of the political economy. I've spent a lot of time looking at Silicon Valley and the tribalism of the tech world and how that has created all kinds of distorted and sometimes dangerous patterns. I've looked at the problem of tribalism and silos in the corporate sphere. I've continued to look at how cultural patterns shape our vision of economics. But the other thing I've been trying to do recently is look particularly at some of the ways that technological change is shaping our cultural patterns around our everyday social interactions and reshaping aspects of how our political economy works. And it's that I want to talk about right now in relation to the title, which is A Society in the Midst of Change. Because I think that there are two really quite fundamental shifts going on in our societies today as a result of this, our cell phones, which we just don't think or talk nearly enough about, but which have some really big impacts on not just the world of consumer culture and our social interactions, but also politics and finance as well. And I sometimes joke that we spend all this time talking about artificial intelligence and AI, but actually what we ought to be thinking about as well is another type of AI, which is after iPhone. We live in a world which is after the iPhone. And there's a big difference between the patterns before the iPhone and after the iPhone in terms of what it means for our social interaction. And in essence, the key issue, or the two key issues that I think we need to think about is firstly, who do we trust? And secondly, how do we imagine the relationship between the individual and society? So let me start with the first question, which is about who do we trust? Now, as an anthropologist, you learn, or we used to learn in the 20th century, that there are two types of trust which can glue societies together. On the one hand, you can have horizontal trust, which is what happens between peer groups in small groups where people know each other face to face. And you can trust each other as a group that way, and that enables that group to hang together and to do things, to do business and things like that. But that's vertical trust. There's also, that's horizontal trust. There's also a second type of trust, which is vertical trust, which is when groups come together and they trust in a leader or an institution or a system or a bureaucracy, or in the modern world, a CEO, a government official, a central bank governor, things like that. So you have horizontal trust, peer group trust, and then you have vertical trust, trust in the leader and institution. And historically, anthropologists thought that small groups often used more horizontal trust, but when they became big, you had vertical trust. What this has done is create, for the first time in history, the possibility of establishing horizontal trust on a massive scale. By that I mean, you're seeing the rise of what anthropologists call distributed trust. And by that I mean that essentially through digital networks, massive groups of people across a wide area essentially are acting as if they trusted each other because of their connections on digital platforms. That sounds very abstract, but if you think for a moment about why you would get into a stranger's car with Uber each day, it's not because you necessarily trust Uber, the company, although you might do. It's because, to a large degree, the trust that is created in Uber is based on peer-to-peer ratings that give you some sense of checks and balance and security. And if you like, the wisdom of crowds rating and judging drivers. If a driver behaves really badly, they'll have a really low rating and you won't trust them. Or if you think about what happens when you go on holiday, 20 years ago, you might have gone to a travel agent or an expert, an authority figure, who might have told you what was a good place to go on holiday to. Now you're just as likely to go online and look at peer ratings of the crowd to judge whether something is trustworthy or not. Or if you think about what drives Bitcoin, essentially fiat currency relies on trust in a central bank and a central banker. A platform like Bitcoin relies on trust in the crowd via technology in a very different way. So what you're seeing over and over again is a shift from vertical trust to horizontal trust. And you can see that quite clearly if you look at surveys, because in the last 20 years, surveys show very clearly that in the Western world, trust in authority figures, in politicians, in CEOs, in other leaders has fallen very dramatically. Trust in institutions has declined. And so people often say, well, trust as a whole has collapsed. And the truth is that trust on a vertical axis has collapsed, but trust on a horizontal axis. And if you look at, say, what's happened with something like the Edelman Trust Barometer and the picture that it presents in recent years, what you can see very clearly is there's been a very sharp decline in trust in terms of trust on a vertical axis, but trust in a horizontal axis has actually been very strong. To give you an example of this, if you ask, do we trust establishment leaders to tell us the truth? At the moment, 63% of people say they don't trust government leaders, 61% say they don't trust business leaders, and 64% say they don't trust journalists and reporters. But if you look at the category called a person like me, you're seeing basically rising levels of trust to quite a startling degree. I mean, if you look at, say, the question of who society trusts to tell me the truth about new innovations and technologies, what this year's survey showed was that only 45% trust government leaders, only 47% trust journalists, only 51% trust CEOs, but 74% trust a category called a person like me. And 74% also trust scientists. So there's been a real shift in terms of how we trust each other and the kind of areas where we get essentially looked for as a source of guidance and wisdom as we navigate the world. Now, on one level, that sounds really empowering and really positive. We like the idea of getting trust from each other. We like the idea that we have a voice, that we can actually don't have to rely on a hierarchy, that we actually have a more egalitarian world. And that's particularly marked with Gen Z. But the problem with this is twofold. Firstly, there's a question about whether or not crowd trust, group trust can be manipulated. But secondly, there's also a question about which crowd, which group, which tribe you're listening to. Because something else has happened at the same time as this trust pattern, and it is a shift in the relationship between the individual and society. And to go back to anthropology again, anthropologists have long pointed out that in most cultures, in most parts of the world, the individual is seen as a derivative of society. In other words, the society is dominant and the individual is simply seen as a cog in a machine or a piece of a puzzle. Your identity, your role, your life is given to you often at birth, and in most cultures, you are expected to accept that. And then starting really in 18th and then 19th century Europe, this idea developed that individuals are actually at the center of society, and society is a derivative of the individual. If you think about the concept of I think, therefore I am, that indicates that I, as a human being individual, I exist before society. Or if you think of the idea of human rights, I, the individual, have rights, which society is secondary or part of. Or if you think of the rise in the 20th century of the so-called me generation, which led to people like Margaret Thatcher saying, there is no such thing as society, there are just lots of individuals. So in the 20th century, we had a Copernican shift in how we imagine individuals and society. And what's happened in the 21st century is that this shift, I think, has gone even further. And we've gone from not just thinking that we are the center of our world, but to thinking that we have the right to fashion and organize the world around our personal desires, our own customized, personalized desires. And again, that sounds very abstract and vague, but if you think for a moment about what's happened with music, 100 years ago, if you wanted to listen to music, you probably had to go to a concert, which was organized on someone else's schedule, playing someone else's choice of music. And you had to go and join in on their framework. You couldn't customize it to you. And then we had the rise of radio, when you could switch on the radio, but someone else was choosing what to play. And then we had the rise of vinyl records and cassettes, where essentially you could listen to music when you wanted, and you could sort of choose what to listen to, but the combination of songs was chosen by somebody else. Then we had the rise of essentially cassettes where you could mix your songs. And then we had the rise of playlists and iPods. And today, we live in a world where it is taken for granted that if you want to listen to music, you can choose what you listen to, where you listen to, how you listen to it, exactly in whatever combination you want to listen. And you can even put headphones on and listen to it in the middle of a crowded space entirely on your own personalized demand. It's like we're living in our own version of the Matrix film, where you can fashion the world around you. And digitization, these iPhones, are extending this concept more and more into many areas of our life. I mean, in consumer culture, 50 years ago, most schools served a school lunch, which was basically chosen by the school, by the chef, and you just given it as a pupil, and you either ate it or not. Today, almost every school in England and America has a buffet, because it's now assumed that kids should be able to pick and mix food as they want. If you have a family dinner, maybe in Portugal it's different, but in America and the UK, it's incredibly hard to get an entire family to eat the same food. One person's vegetarian, one person's got a soy allergy, etc., etc. And in almost every area of consumer culture, there is this growing idea that personalization, customization is normal. And that's now being extended into many other areas as well. In the world of work, people like me grew up with the idea that a job meant you had to go to an office, work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, with a career ladder, which was kind of set for you. Post-COVID, you have Gen Z that increasingly says, well, I want to work from home on Fridays, and I'll come in on Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and I might do this, I might do that. I want control of my career. Or if you go into politics, you used to have just political parties dominating, which are like vinyl records, which are a pre-assembled list of ideas and policies. Now you're seeing increasingly the rise of issue politics. People care about Greens, but not the party, or they care about a personality, be that Donald Trump, or be that, a radical left-wing leader. They care about issues and brands, often nationalism, things like that. And if you can even extrapolate it into the world of finance, where increasingly, if you look at what's driving so much of the zeitgeist behind, say, the rise of digital money, it's this idea that, I don't want to live with the money that the government or the authority figures in the country I live in is giving to me. I want my own money, or I want my own control over my own app with my investments. Personalization, customization, this idea that I am the center of my world is becoming more and more stark. And it's also playing into identities. You know, the days where you had to just accept the identity that you were given at birth and live with that all your life are being replaced by the idea that I can go online and I can define my identity exactly as I want, how I want. Now, when you put those two trends together, what you have is a world that on the one hand feels very empowering and very exciting. You know, I matter. I can personalize my world. I can trust my peer group for information. And most of us are addicted to that. We like that idea. The downside, though, is that when people go online and choose their own identity, they don't just become tribal, but they cling to their tribal allegiances and symbols, in some ways even stronger than otherwise, because they chose it. And when you have these different tribal groups emerging online, coupled with this shift in trust from vertical to horizontal, what you have is a recipe for echo chambers. You have a recipe for a cyber world which is full of different competing groups online who are suddenly prone to passions erupting. Something goes viral, they get consumed by an idea or a fashion, and then suddenly it dies down again. It's a world where you have polarization. It's a world where you have a lot of misunderstandings between generations. It's a world where it's very hard to create rational policy choices. It's a world where it's very hard to talk about policy trade-offs. And it's a world that's very unfamiliar to a lot of leaders who would think that they are running companies and banks and hedge funds and companies and countries today. I mean, one of the biggest clashes I hear the whole time from CEOs is that they just cannot understand, you know, why Gen Z think they have a right to come into the office from, you know, 9 until 3 on a Friday and then just go home, or why they have a right to say, I only care about this, but not that. And there's an assumption that it's just Gen Z being selfish or impractical, or they've been ruined by COVID. In reality, it's simply Gen Z extrapolating what they have absorbed from their consumer culture onto the world as a whole. And I very strongly think that if we don't get to grips with these shifts and recognize how trust has changed, recognized how this era of customization is changing many areas of our life, then we're going to be talking past each other. And in terms of trying to talk about some of the big challenges dogging the political economies today, we need to work out how to work with these changes, not against. How do we recognize that people want a sense of empowerment? How do we recognize that blind allegiance to a single, you know, authority figure is not something many people actually accept anymore? And what does that mean about the rise of populism, about the rise of all types of fragmentation going forward? So those are my thoughts about some of the big changes going on from an anthropologist perspective. I'm very happy to take questions on
Yes.
that or anything else.
Gillian, it was a fantastic lesson. Thank you very much. It was a remarkable vision that you gave us about what's going on in our society. And I think most of us agree with you on these changes that we are facing. So we have here different people that work in different areas with different experience. And I will try to get from them some questions and comments. I asked Mario Franco, that has a long experience in international relations and also in things connected with humanity. Mario, do you want to make some question to Gillian or to comment the topics?
Oh, thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Gillian, for the very, 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 very interesting presentation of some of the ideas we cross from time to time or every day. I will because I am the first one. I would like to raise two questions and maybe to see what is your vision on that. One is I think a kind of contradiction between the fact then or not the fact then the people want to have more choices and create their own worlds, but at the same time we see the rise of leaders, strong leaders, like populism in America and in Europe, where there is a kind of delegation of power to a single person. Then I think we are moving from a strong system to a strong man or to a strong person. That for me is a contradiction, because for one side the person is more free and want more freedom to choose, and at the same time the person delegates the power in one person and is only expecting what this person is going to do, because there is not a clear vision what the person do. The second point is more on the business side, and I think one of the most interesting parts, and you mentioned that, is about the value and the value of money, not only in the perspective that the money now people want to maybe to use digital currency or cryptocurrency, but the fact that the people are more open now, I mean, anthropologically speaking, to attribute value to something which is more, in commas, more metaphysical. How is your vision in long term? How this movement unique, original, or in your perspective there is a trend? Because the fact that we have money and the money has been accepted before the digitalization was also a kind of virtualization of the value. Then this trend of virtualization of the value, is that, in your opinion, a trend in long term or a moment? Maybe that two questions.
Julian, can we get the three questions, or do you prefer answer one by one?
Can I answer that question, both of those questions first, because they're both huge issues, very interesting.
Okay. Yes,
very
please.
conceptual interest. On the first issue of why does an era of pick and mix and, if you like, customization and a shift in trust patterns, why is that going hand in hand with the rise of populism? The bitter irony of a world of, pick and mix choices is that, firstly, what you're seeing in politics, I think, is the rise of brands, and it's all about brands. Again, it's an extrapolation from consumer culture. And people aren't really voting on policies per se as brands, as shiny objects, in much the same way that they might go for music or fashion or something like that. And it's a way of opting out and saying, I am, in the case of Donald Trump, I'm a MAGA Donald Trump supporter. That's my brand, my choice. And, it's part of what plays into it, I personally think. And, it's quite striking. I mean, again, it's a bitter irony. If you compare the language that someone like Donald Trump used back in 2016 versus Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, what you basically had back in 2016 was Trump using language about make America great again. It was all about verbs and empowerment. And I'm going to feel empowered by doing this, even if in practice you're basically surrendering to this populist leader. Hillary Clinton ran on a disastrous slogan, which was, I'm with her, i.e., I'm just giving up myself up to her, rather than using a verb saying, make America great again. Or in the case of Brexit, I think one of the populist Brexit slogans that worked really well was take back control. I'm taking back control. Again, it's an illusion, but it's an illusion that works. And I think the other aspect to think about as to why you see the rise of populism and tribalism is, firstly, people are choosing actively to go into a tribal identity and then clinging onto it. But secondly, that, this sense of customization, this illusion that I can fashion the world around me as I want it, like a coffee choice, like a coffee bar, is also a recipe for profound disillusionment constantly. Because the reality is that, someone who's 25 years old, who thinks they've chosen to be part of a tribal group, they are being political by tweeting, by having their voice, which feels very flattering. I'm going to tell you my thoughts, my voice, project it to everybody. You know, they're not actually got power in a genuine sense, but they think they ought to have power. And it's a recipe for disillusionment, ambitiousness, and anger. And I think that's also fostering a lot of the populism. And a lot of populist leaders are tapping into these currents in a very manipulative and I'd say quite dangerous way. On the second issue about the money and the virtualization and the abstraction of money and value, I would argue that actually, yes, digital money has made value very disembodied and very, abstract in a way that we don't yet fully understand. But the other thing that's happened due to this, which I think is equally important, is that it's opened the way for a lot of non-monetary exchanges. And by that, I mean, one of the biggest exchanges that drives our modern tech economy is the fact that people every day give up their data to tech companies for free in exchange for services which are given back for free. So if you go on to Google, you get free search in exchange de facto for giving up your data as part of that. Now, economists don't really have a way to talk about that because economics in the 20th century was obsessed with money and everything was measured with money. And it was assumed that money was what was important in monetary economics. You know, housework inside the house was devalued because it didn't involve money, whereas work outside the house was considered to be work because it was part of money, paid for with money. But anthropologists have a word for this type of massive exchange of data and services, which is barter. You know, anthropologists know there are many ways to exchange value in a way that binds societies together. And what's going on in the data economy today is not classic barter in that people aren't directly haggling and negotiating, 3 apples for 2 potatoes. Basically it's the tech companies which are setting the terms of trade for that barter. But that barter is huge and it drives so much of our lived experiences. And I think most people instinctively know that. It helps to play into this idea, if people even can't articulate it, that their lived experience is not just about money. And I think the fact that people know that there's an exchange going on, which is kind of convenient to them, is one reason why people accept the massive grab of data every day by tech companies and continue to use tech services, because there have been a number of experiments where companies have tried to offer consumers services which they pay for with money without giving up their data, and they don't fly. People actually prefer, I think, this barter trade, even if they know that the terms of trade are grotesquely unfair and stacked in favor of the tech companies. So that's what I'd say about that.
Thank you very much, Gillian. We have now Alexander, that I think wants also to make a question. Please, Alexander.
Hello. Sorry, I cannot put my video. I'm in the airport. Nice to hear all you said, Gillian. I had 2 questions. One is something you slightly mentioned, which is the disinformation that this horizontal trust exponentiates, and we see that all over the place, in the wars, in the elections, and everywhere. How that gets organized again, or at least trusted. That would be my first question. And the second is, any thought on how do we redesign what we teach children's, how society and the things, the values, and how trustworthy should work, if you understand my question.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, 2 points to make. 2 points to make. Firstly, this horizontal trust can be manipulated and is manipulated all the time. And in many ways, it's a great illusion to think that these crowds are getting a pure version of trust in these platforms without manipulation. And one of the tragedies of the younger generation is they often don't realize this, and the older generation. And one of the great dangers is that essentially what you're creating are these echo chambers which don't necessarily overlap, where there isn't trust in an authority figure anymore, and where the different tribes each have wrong information or misinformation or are being manipulated. And that is a real issue. It's at the core of what's going wrong in a lot of American democratic politics today, et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely agree, they're prone to manipulation. The second point, though, which was, sorry, remind me of your second question again, because I had a, oh yeah, about what to teach kids. Yeah.
Yes.
So what to teach kids? Well, it's really interesting because, you know, we teach kids in school today about cyber hygiene, cyber security, cyberbullying. We teach kids about that. We tend not to tell them about cyber tribalism and about the dangers of going into these cyber tribes, because the tech companies and the tools are all designed to feed you up more of what you choose. So they double down on customization and they take you down rabbit holes. So if you go online and say you're interested in Donald Trump, they will give you more Donald Trump and then more Donald Trump and more and more and more. They all take you down these customized rabbit holes. There are things we could do about that. We could demand that the tech companies actually don't do this filter bubble customization. Again, most people may not want that because we're used to assuming that customization is good. But we have to teach kids about customization. And we also have to try and teach them about how to verify information. And there is a huge generational gap in terms of how we verify information. There's a fascinating team that work with Google who are anthropologists who've been doing a lot of anthropology studies, looking at Generation Z and what they trust and what they don't trust, you know, and studying them as if they were, you know, a tribal group in the Amazon or something like that. And they've also done studies of people who believe in misinformation. And what they show very clearly is that most of the things that the older generation and educated generation assume about how to counter misinformation are totally wrong. To give one example, the anthropologists went and studied conspiracy theorists, many hours with conspiracy theorists in America and the UK. And before they did the study, they had assumed that the best way to counter conspiracy theories was to put a professional looking website on the internet, which basically proved that the conspiracy theories were wrong, with scientific looking data that actually had the credibility. And the reason was that people who are trained to work at tech companies as coders or CEOs have been educated to assume that science has credibility and professional looking websites command authority. And what became clear from doing the anthropology amongst the conspiracy theorists is that they associate anything which looks too glossy and shiny and perfect as being part of the state or the deep state, and thereby lacking credibility. And the websites that they trusted were the ones which looked more homemade and scruffy and amateur rather than too professional. So that simple misunderstanding, that's the anthropologist's idea, that we all project and assume that other people think like us, indicates this gap. The other gap is that the older generation assumes that if you want to trust information in a newspaper, you go online and you research scientific articles or credible sources of information based on this vertical hierarchy. All the studies show that Gen Z has grown up in a world where they use social media like a weather vane. And if they want to trust the veracity of something, they go online, they listen to the crowd, they look at the comments underneath different posts. They know that no single comment is true, but they try and read the weather as a whole in a 360-degree way. It's a really different way of passing information. Again, it's a pattern which anthropologists have looked at a lot, whether you try and navigate with GPS on a top-down basis, or whether you do what anthropologists call sense making, which is navigate by smelling the environment around you, smelling as much as you can, feeling what it looks like, and then coming to your best guess. That is how the younger generation is using social media to tell what is true. It's different. And so anyone who's trying to teach people about what is truth or how to counter misinformation needs to recognize that. And the last point I'll make, which is, again, I mean, you can find all this research on Jigsaw. If you look under the branch of Google called Jigsaw, they've got these anthropologists doing all these studies. It's all published. The other really important finding they found was that when it comes to healthcare information and increasingly financial information, Gen Z trusts personalized bots more than authority figures. So they trust a personalized bot, an AI tool that they feel is customized to their own needs and which they engage in seemingly on a horizontal level more than a senior doctor. And this research is just coming out now. It's really interesting. To my generation, it sounds absolutely insane. But a generation that grew up assuming that they want a one-on-one friend, even if it's an artificial friend online, who can customize their responses to what I want, is a generation that has a very different concept of what is true and what is trust.
Okay, we have now two more questions. One is Teresa, and before you have another person, can you put your question?
Me, Shine?
No, we have another person I cannot identify. It's in iPhone. But are you listening, please? Okay, then put you, Teresa, if you please.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Gillian, for all you have been sharing with us. I have this question. We are going through huge transitions, a huge technological transition, in ecological or environmental transition, social transition, where I would say we would need to trust each other and trust all the stakeholders involved in this, and where we would need to collaborate, where we will need to collaborate a lot. And we sense that people are not really satisfied, and because we see lots of anxieties, there's a huge mental crisis. What would you say that companies and governments and maybe even ourselves, because I think that we also have, each one of us has a responsibility of this, what we think we could do to address all these issues and to build a positive shared future?
Well, it's tough. First point to realize is that we are indeed grappling with really big societal questions and policy choices which demand a recognition of trade-offs. We don't talk enough about trade-offs, and it's very hard to talk about trade-offs in a world of competing echo chambers. Point one. Point two is to recognize that actually the days when we just assumed that a authority figure could say something and people would believe it and act on it, are not the world we're living in today. So people need to recognize, if you are a CEO and trying to talk to investors or employees, the days when you could just say, okay, I'm the CEO telling you what's happening, this is the truth, get on with it, are over. I mean, you have things like Glassdoor, where people can find out what's happening in companies. You have employee chat rooms. You have all types of social media platforms and ways of people scrutinizing companies and finding out what's happening and protesting. And that on one level is very empowering and very good. We would not have had the #MeToo movement without the internet. That's just the reality. But it's also potentially very dangerous sometimes, and it's very difficult for leaders to recognize. So they need to recognize that they are going to be, scrutinized from all angles. And they either play into that and accept it, or they will get caught short. I think the third point is they need to recognize they're dealing with a generation that wants to feel that they are empowered. And that may be an illusion, and it very often is an illusion. But there needs to be a realization that any messages you want to give need to be packaged with a sense of empowerment and customization and individuality, even if it is a complete illusion. And I think the fourth thing we need to think about is how we can play into some of these trends in a positive way. I mean, on one level, it's absolutely fantastic that people can choose their own identities and choose what they want to fight for. And we need to be encouraging them to be making good choices. And, you know, essentially fighting for things that they care about in a positive sense. It's not easy, but, you know, if you look at how fashions go viral and then die down, if you look at things like the impact of, say, Greta Thunberg's, you know, Fridays for Protest or Fridays for Climate movement, you know, it's a really interesting question whether you would have had the scale of corporate engagement in green issues were it not for the fact that a young kid who believed she had the right to just opt out of school and sit down had not started doing that. Other kids saw it. It went viral. A whole community, you know, basically engaged with that and spread with that. And then a group of, you know, you can argue quite entitled kids then started yelling at their parents over the dinner table, and, you know, creating a sense that attitudes were changing. So, you know, it's a scary time. I'm under no illusions about that. But, you know, I think it's a change that we can't reverse quickly because we can't uninvent the iPhone.
Gillian, we are approaching to the end because we combined 1 hour. We have a final question. And Paul, do you want to make a final question?
Thank you, Jaime. Gillian, yes, I was thinking about this fundamental need to belong, right? And how does that apply to the corporate world? So is there a digital anthropology in the corporate world? How can we use those symbols to generate, let's hope, positive network effects? And how can that be incorporated in a more systematic way into our daily world for those like me that create companies as a way of living and are worried and now working in the growth area? That's it.
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely a need to belong. It's a very human trait. And I'd say the difference today compared to 300 years ago is that, you know, your identity and what you belonged to previously was just given to you. And now people feel like they're actively choosing what they belong to. Again, it's an illusion a lot of the time, but that feeling of choice is critical. And there's a wonderful book by someone called Joseph Henrich called Weird. And he uses the word weird in acronyms, meaning Western educated, individualistic, rich and democratic, WEIRD. And, you know, he makes a point about, you know, how most societies didn't have, you know, in most societies, most cultures, if someone asks you, who are you? You say, I am the son of so-and-so, or I am the wife of so-and-so, or I am the chieftain of so-and-so. You know, today you try asking a teenager, who are you? You get a sort of list this long of what they think they are. And when it comes to companies and how they engage with this, you know, the good news is that companies can use that in a really positive way. You know, all of the data shows that, you know, kids, teenagers want to work for companies that match their values. You know, if they feel that they're doing good in the world, then that helps. You know, that helps recruitment. It helps, you know, retain people, et cetera, et cetera. But conversely, you know, if they don't feel that the company's one that they choose individualistically to want to join and uphold, they often get alienated or not interested. And so I guess the question really is, do companies, if you're building a company, want to find a way to tap into that desire for people to actively choose to be part of a group, you know, or not? You can be cynical and say this is basically a bull market phenomena. And if there's a recession and people are desperate to get jobs, then that will change. But at the moment, it hasn't. And the last thing I'll say is about the working practices and working week, because as I say, you know, post-COVID, certainly in the US and the UK, there's been a shift in expectations around work and a shift in terms of the idea that people ought to own their own careers and own their own work. And you know, yes, part of the working from home is the rise of Zoom culture, but it's also because the days when a CEO could just tell new employees, you are just going to suck it up. You're going to be in here at 9, out here at 5, or whatever, in here at 8, out here at 6, Monday to Friday, get on with it. If you want to get promoted, you know, you just need to start at the bottom of the ladder and go ding, 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 ding. You know, that's a 20th century vision of how work was supposed to work. Many young people today don't have that vision. A few do. Going into investment banking, they often accept that. But many young people don't. And I say that working in a university right now. And as Sheryl Sandberg once said, it's not really about a jungle gym anymore. People see their jobs like it's not really like about a career ladder anymore. People see their jobs as being like a jungle gym. You know, they go up, sideways, swing around a bit, work out where to go next, etc., etc. So, you know, you either play into that or you don't.
Okay, Gillian, I think we filled 1 hour. It was a fantastic lesson. Thank you very much again for your disponibility. I think it was a very interesting discussion, and we are in touch, and maybe we can meet, we never know, in Portugal, okay? Have a nice week, and it was a pleasure, okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It was a pleasure, okay? Bye-bye, thank you.